Hey everybody, how's it going out there? Got another story for y'all today. Another tale of forgotten American folklore. This is the legend of the Tame Trout. Now I'm sure to most of you today that name probably doesn't really mean anything, right? But if you were alive back in say like 1898, 1910, 1905, something like that, right? There would be a very good chance that you would have read, you know, some kind of version of this story in like an old book, a newspaper, a pamphlet, a magazine, a biography, like something like that, right? In fact, the story of the Tame Trout used to be a mainstay among the old guard of classic American oral folklorists. And nowadays, it is pretty much evaporated. But this story is way too good to let disappear into the pages of history. So please, indulge me, take my hand, and together, let's blow a little life back into one of the best stories of American folklore that I have ever uncovered. So like I said, I found about a bajillion different versions of this story, like all across the United States throughout the early 1900s, like books, newspapers, whatever. Like, for example, here's a traveling salesman in Detroit who swears that the Tame Trout story happened to him specifically. And here's some woodsman in Duluth telling the story. And here's one of my favorites. It's a little 10-year-old boy swearing that the story of the Tame Trout happened to him specifically. But despite all those people claiming its origin, make no mistake, the father of the Tame Trout story is Ed Grant of Maine. So Ed Grant is sort of this like a semi-famous mountain man and storyteller who used to haunt the woods of Maine back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The earliest versions of the Tame Trout story that I could find are all from his mouth, and a whole lot of the versions that I found in other places mentioned him, at least somewhere in there, like, oh, this story happened to Ed Grant first, or I heard this from Ed Grant, like that type of thing, right? So the version of the story that I'm going to tell you here today is going to be informed first and foremost by the words of the man himself. I was able to dig up a pretty thorough version of the story from this like 20-page pamphlet that was published in 1904 that I found. Basically, it sounds like some dude like went up to visit Ed Grant, asked him to tell a whole bunch of stories, and then wrote them all down in this little book. I'm going to sprinkle in a few tidbits and details from other versions, but by and large, this is going to be Ed Grant's telling of the Tame Trout. Oh, and by the way, before we get too deep into this, I got to nip something in the bud. You see, I can see the writing on the wall already. I know that there's going to be a few naysayers in my audience on this one. A few people who think that old Ed is spinning a yarn, that he's not quite being truthful with us. But let me tell you, take it from me, I can tell you with 100% certainty that Ed Grant is telling us the truth. Why? Because according to those who knew him, Ed Grant was the world's most truthful man. Truthful Ed, they used to call him. So believe me, this story is completely real. But alright, enough lollygagging. Let me set the scene for you. It's early spring, 1895, and Ed Grant is sitting on the banks of some kind of body of water, maybe one just like this, and he's casting, he's fishing, and he's reeling in trout after trout after trout, and each one looks pretty much just like the last. He's chucking them back, he's casting out for more, until he reels in one little trout that looks a little bit different. You see, according to Ed, this trout, he's got a high brow, he's got a dimpled chin, he's got a smooth face, and most importantly, he's got big, bright, intelligent eyes. So Ed Grant scoops that little guy up, looks him in the face, and thinks, hey, you know what? I've been thinking for a while that if you find a smart enough fish, you could probably train him, just like you can a cat or a dog. So Ed Grant decided, well, this fish was a great candidate to test out his little theory. He found himself a little tub, filled that up with water, and tossed his trout in there to splash around. Now, before I continue with the story, let me guess what you probably imagined when I said tame trout. Like, maybe it was a trout that lives in a pond and he has a special relationship with a boy that goes down to the pond. Like, maybe he does tricks when the boy calls the trout's name, or maybe the little trout eats food out of his master's hand, or maybe he, I don't know, you can tie a little leash to the trout and he follows along while you walk along the shore of a river, something like that, right? But let me tell you, all of that is amateur hour in comparison to what Ed Grant wanted to do with his trout. You see, every night, while that little trout was asleep, Ed Grant would sneak into his room, go up to the tub, and let just a little bit of water out. Bit by bit, day by day, the water level in that tub shrank and shrank and shrank and shrank until that little fish was just sitting on bare wood at the bottom of an empty tub, alive. Because as everybody knows, if you take a fish out of water, it'll die, right? It can't breathe air. But if you wean a fish out of water bit by bit so it doesn't realize that it's on land, then hey, you can trick that little fish into thinking that it can breathe air. And that's just what Ed Grant did with his little trout. And from there, a wonderful summer full of all sorts of adventures was kicked off between Ed Grant and his loyal trout. All right, there are all sorts of just hilarious little visual details in the story from this point. I found all sorts of stuff about the trout laying on the windowsill and eating flies and, using its tail to play a Jew's harp and walking a tightrope. But despite all that, the funniest thing to me is just the basic visual of a trout flopping around on land, following its owner. Imagine if you were on a hiking trail and some dude walked by you and you were like, hey, and he was like, hey, and then you hear, and you look behind him and there's a little fish flopping along in the dirt behind its master. Or you live on a farm and you look out the window and there's your horse and your pig and your cows and they're all living out in the pasture, and hey, there's your tame trout flopping around on the doorstep. It wants to come in the house. It's banging its little tail on the door. Better put in a trout door to let him in. But hey, anyway, unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. And the story of Ed Grant and his little trout is no different. You see, on one fateful day, Ed Grant took his trusty companion out for a little walk. And eventually they came across a little wooden bridge passing over a stream, right? They walk out over that bridge with Ed Grant taking the lead, and the whole time he's walking behind him, you can hear his little trout slapping around on the wood of the bridge, right? But then all of a sudden, nothing. Silence. The sound of the trout has gone dark, and Ed Grant looks behind him, and with horror, he sees that his little trout is fallen through a crack in the bridge into the water. And so Ed Grant rushes over to the edge of the bridge, and he looks down in the water, and he sees, unfortunately, that his poor little pet trout has drowned. It gets me every time. And legend has it that whenever Ed Grant was telling this story and he got to this point in his tale, a single tear began to stream down his face as he conjured up the memory of losing his best friend. But Ed Grant, he was also an optimist, and he was able to see the silver lining in the demise of his little fish. He just thought, winter is right around the corner, and my little fish, he just wouldn't be able to get around in all that ice and snow, right? Because a fish living on land is one thing, but a fish being able to travel in snow, that's just way too far-fetched, right? But hey, before we go, you gotta promise me something. You and I, we gotta make a pact. I want you to swear that if you're ever sitting around a campfire ring, maybe you just got done with a fishing trip, maybe you're going camping with some friends, maybe you even got a buddy over and you're sitting in your mom's backyard around that old metal campfire. If anybody ever says, hey, anybody know any good stories? I want you standing up. I want you raising your hand. I want you putting down that s'more, and I want you saying, hey, I know a good one. You guys ever hear about Ed Grant's tame trout? Thanks for watching.